Shalom. Good evening to all our friends in Australia. Good afternoon to our friends in South Africa and Asia. Good morning to our friends in UK. Shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shaya Ben Yehuda, and I am Managing Director of Yad Vashem's International Relations Division, speaking to you from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. During this pandemic, our museum has been temporarily closed by order of the Israeli Ministry of Health. We are encouraging you, everyone, to look at our online resources, such as Yad Vashem's website, which is a treasure trove of information with highly informative articles, courses, lectures, and online databases. We are also sharing Yad Vashem knowledge throughout the world with Zoom lectures. Today, we are beginning a lecture series, hopefully once a month, and at a time which will be convenient for Australians as well as others who live in the UK, Asia, and South Africa. We are very fortunate to have our dear friend, Australian businessman, philanthropist, and Yad Vashem benefactor, Mr. John Gandel, AC, a Jewish leader with a great passion for Holocaust commemoration and education, to introduce today's very eminent lecture. Due to John's incredible work implementing his vision for disseminating Holocaust education throughout Australia, the state of Victoria recently made Holocaust education mandatory in all high schools in Victoria. Dear John, over to you.
Distinguished guests, old friends from around the world, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and shalom to everyone on this virtual online lecture organized by Yad Vashem. My name is John Gandel, and I live in Melbourne, Australia, with my wife Pauline and fortunately a substantial family. Together, we are passionate benefactors and champions of Yad Vashem and its mission, and we have been supporting the Gandel Holocaust Studies program for Australian educators for over 10 years. Before we start, I'm aware that there are a small number of Holocaust survivors with us on the video call. I would like to acknowledge them all, and we should feel very honored that they are joining us for this lecture. Let me also add that it appears that this lecture has created enormous interest, so much so that Yad Vashem had to upgrade their Zoom capacity from 500 to 1,000 participants. However, I feel that should not be a great surprise, simply because of the caliber of person you will hear today. I feel truly honored and privileged to introduce our most distinguished speaker, Professor Yehuda Bauer, the doyen of Holocaust study. Professor Bauer's wisdom, knowledge, and sharp mind have been a source of great inspiration for researchers and educators from around the world for generations now. What does one say about the person of the stature of Professor Bauer, of the legendary body of work he produced in research and in education? The person who is a national treasure and the global expert on the Holocaust. Well, perhaps I can add but a few points of interest. Professor Bauer was born in Prague, then Czechoslovakia, in 1926. The story goes that his father managed to raise enough money to get the family to Palestine to avoid the looming war in Europe. In fact, it is said that they left on the very day when Germany took control over Bohemia and Moravia. Professor Bauer had a colorful early life, from being part of Palmach, the Jewish underground, to being in the Israeli army, but also working as a tourist guide, as he said, I quote, taking Jewish ladies wearing big hats from Hadassah around the Galilee, and learning foreign languages along the way. He speaks, by the way, 8 languages. But for a long time, kibbutznik, a turning point in Bauer's life was meeting a former leader of Lithuanian partisans, a Holocaust survivor and a poet, Abba Kovner. As a result of their conversations, Professor Bauer was inspired to devote his life to Holocaust studies. Even though Professor Bauer admitted to being scared to study the Holocaust, Kovner convinced him, saying that Shoah is the most important event in Jewish history, and that, I quote, being scared is a very good starting point. Today, almost 60 years later, Bauer remains one of the world's leading scholars on the study of the Holocaust. With more than 90 published works and dozens of books under his belt, several professorships and memberships of numerous committees and advisory bodies. Professor Bauer is an academic advisor at Yad Vashem, and he is the Professor of Holocaust Studies at the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Now, I could go on about Professor Bauer's awards, distinctions, and accolades in his life, from his 1998 Israel Prize to his Yakir Yerushalayim Worthy Citizen of Jerusalem Award in 2008, or indeed his Nachum Goldman Medal from 2018 from the World Jewish Congress, in recognition of his contribution to Jewish scholarship and education. But I don't really need to go through that. You can Google it all yourselves. What I really want to say is that we're in the presence of a man, a mensch, whose quantity of intellect, remarkable breadth of knowledge, and the sheer scale of contribution to humanity is almost unparalleled. Here is an academic who is famous amongst historians for continuing to find new evidence on the Holocaust, who continues to revise his opinions and draw new conclusions about the progress of the Nazi genocide. And an academic who is famous for his incisive, razor-sharp and penetrating views, solidly backed up with decades of deep and forensic research. As one contemporary put it so aptly, everything Bauer touches, he illuminates. In short, we are in for an amazing presentation, so please get ready. Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests from around the world, it gives me immense pleasure to present to you Professor Yehuda Bauer, who will deliver the inaugural online Yad Vashem lecture titled The Unprecedentiveness of the Holocaust, What Makes It Unique in Light of Other Genocides. Professor Bauer, over to you.
Thank you very much. After this introduction, I think I should better be good, so as not to disappoint you too much. The topic is actually, of course, the relationship between the Holocaust and other genocides. And in the present situation of a pandemic, which I think clarifies to all of us that we are, all of us, in the same boat, all of humanity. And whether you are an Australian Aborigine or a professor at Jerusalem or Harvard or Oxford or Canberra or anywhere else, you are basically the same. Now, within that, we have over tens of thousands of years, we've been killing each other. And the most extreme case of this vast array of mutual killings is, of course, the Holocaust. So I think I should start by trying to see what exactly do we mean by this, by the term genocide? The term genocide was coined by a Polish Jewish refugee lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who managed to flee to the United States in 1941 through Sweden and became a constant person of reminiscence and of action within America in a very short period of time. And he managed to convince the State Department to try to organize an international law, a kind of a general understanding in order to try to prevent as much as possible this vast mutual killing tradition. And he coined the term probably about 1943, and then published it 1 year later in a very important book. And it became the basic start for the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide, which was passed unanimously by the United Nations in December 1948. Now, that wasn't exactly what he had in mind, but it was based on his thoughts. And this was 3 years after the end of World War II. So the term genocide obviously had a lot to do with what happened during World War II. And even in 1948, people already had realized the vast extent of what today we call the Holocaust. And so the convention has become international law. The definition of genocide in the Convention of 1948 says more or less, and you can Google it, it's very easy. It says that genocide is the intent and action to annihilate an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such, in whole or in part. And if you find anywhere in the world that something like that is about to happen, or is happening, or has been happening, or has happened, you should turn to the United Nations to do something about it. But of course, to turn to the United Nations actually means to turn to the Security Council, because the Security Council is the only body at the United Nations which can actually do something instead of just talking, which is what the United Nations normally do. And at the United Nations Security Council, as you all know, there are 15 members. 5 of them have a veto power. And you all know their names. You know, all of you know who they are. It's America, Russia, China, Britain, and France. And all of them have to agree in order for a resolution to pass into something that approaches reality, some action, which is extremely difficult, because there'll always be one of those 5 who will not be happy with any action that will prevent mass murder. And the other 10 members of the Security Council, who rotate every now and then, out of those there have to be 3 more who will join to have a majority in the Security Council. So it's extremely difficult, almost impossible, to pass a resolution which will actually end in action. It's not totally impossible, because it actually happened 3 times between 1948 and 2020 that there was a unanimity in the Security Council to do something. One case was in Europe, Macedonia, where the Albanian minority was supported by Albanian state and groups all out of Macedonia was threatening with a civil war that would have caused massive human losses. Nobody was interested in this. Not the Russians, not the Americans, not the British, not the Chinese. And so the United Nations sent a body of troops to Macedonia, and they managed to separate the enemies and ultimately to end up with a compromise, a political compromise, and that compromise holds to this day. The second case was in the neighborhood of our Australian friends. Neighborhood, well, in a sort of general way, in Indonesia. The island of Timor, the eastern part of that island, was occupied by Indonesian forces, and the local ethnic group rebelled against the Indonesians, and massacres took place. And a real danger of annihilation of the ethnic groups that formed practically, well, the vast majority of the area of Eastern Timor. And again, apart from the Indonesian government, nobody was interested in this. And so the United Nations Security Council gave permission to the Australian and New Zealand forces to enter Timor, separate the enemies, and ultimately arrange for a referendum which was practically unanimous for independence. And so to this day we have the Republic of Timor-Leste, which is a result of this action. And the third case was in 2007 in Kenya, where there were disputed elections and danger of usual mass killings by the local ethnic groups. And again, nobody was interested in this. And so the Security Council sent Kofi Annan, who had just finished being the Secretary General of the United Nations, himself an African, to go to Nairobi in Kenya, arrange for peace, arrange for agreement on how to govern the country, and that compromise holds to this day. So there are three cases in between 1948 and today where this worked, and hundreds of cases where it did not work. Hundreds of cases. So the genocide in Rwanda, the mass killings of genocide in Cambodia, the killing of the Mayas in Guatemala, the tremendous losses of life in conflicts, ethnic, national, other conflicts throughout the world, which either were genocides or were very close to genocide, or of mass killings, mass murder, where the difference between that and a genocide is difficult to establish. And that happened all the time, all over the world. So the convention, from that point of view, has been a failure. Should we therefore give up on the convention? Well, it's the best thing we have. And there's at least a theoretical possibility that at some point we might reach an agreement to use the convention. This is not the case at the moment. Now, the definition, let me come back to that, is very problematic because it includes racial groups. See, ethnic, national, racial, religious. But there are no races. The human race is one, as we now experience. We all, originally, all of us, whether we are black, white, blue, yellow, green, or whatever, originally come from East Africa about 300,000 years ago. It's been proved by DNA probes. The differences in color of skin and color of hair and color of eyes and shape of body and so on are secondary and tertiary mutations which are not really important. If Aborigine chief in Australia manages to win the heart of a professor in Harvard or in Jerusalem, they will produce healthy children because we are one race. Now, there are no races, but there's racism. And racism is a European invention of the 15th century. When the northern Spanish Christian forces pushed back the Arabs, the Muslims in Spain further and further out. And in 1449, when the Christian forces occupied Toledo in Spain, they published a decree that anyone with Muslim or Jewish blood, because they thought that, you know, genetics worked through blood. Anyone with that kind of blood cannot be a high civil servant and not a high officer or clergy in a Christian church. That's the origin of racism. And they pushed out in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain, and in the same year, the Moors, the Arabs, the Muslims were expelled from Spain. And then the Christian Spanish and later Portuguese occupied parts of the coast of Africa, especially West Africa. And they founded commercial settlements there, and the slave trade began. Slave trade to the Americas. And the slaves, the black slaves, were enslaved by other Africans. And then they were sold to Arab traders. And then the Arab traders sold them to the white merchants in the harbors of West Africa. And then they were carried over on ships in terrible conditions, with terrible loss of life, to the Americas. And they had to justify this stuff somehow. And the obvious justification was the color of the skin of these slaves. Blacks were obviously a lower race because they were slaves. And then you have racism, which then translates itself into other forms of discrimination. Now, this kind of a mutation is tremendously important for us to understand. And you see, what you then have is a situation in the world where you ask yourself, where does this idea come from, or where does this action come from, of groups killing other groups, or representative of groups in the name of groups killing other groups? When did it start? And the answer is very clear, very obvious. It started with the beginning of the human race. The problem is that we are, of course, originally we come from our ancestors come from the animal world. And in the animal world, you have a little bit similar things, not quite the same, not quite parallel, but similar. The closest animals to the humans are the chimpanzees. Now, we are not very fond of being compared to chimpanzees. And I don't know whether anyone has asked chimpanzees whether they like to be compared to humans. But in any case, the behavior of chimpanzee groups and the behavior of human groups are very similar to each other. Not the same, not exactly parallel, because there is a difference. We share with the chimpanzees only 98.8% of our DNA, 1.2% we don't share. And when the two groups meet, chimpanzees or humans, there are 5 options. One option is to absorb the other group, because it will strengthen us if we absorb somebody else. We may be too weak on our own. And it happens all the time. People being absorbed into other groups. The second option is to enslave the other group, or rather to make it work, even if it's not actually enslaved. Make it work for us, because there are jobs we don't like to do. So let somebody else do it. When Turkish immigrants came to Germany some 30 years ago, they were asked to come because the Germans didn't like to work on building roads or building buildings or serving in restaurants and so on. So these Turkish people came along. And then after a long while, they became citizens. And they merged, part of them at least, quite successfully, into the German population. This is repeated all over the place. Sometimes the enslavement lasts for a very, very long time. In India, for instance, with a caste system, the lower caste were actually groups that were conquered by people who came from elsewhere. And they exist to this day, the lower caste in India, the Dalit. You have the same in America, where the Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Catholics, the Anglo-Saxon ones, absorbed other people coming from elsewhere. And then came the Irish and the Poles and the Baltics and the Russians and the Jews and the Italians, and they all occupied low positions because the old aristocracy, it became an aristocracy, didn't like to do those jobs. And then slowly they became part of the community, not all of them. The blacks were slaves, and they were kept as slaves because of racism in America to this day. Under pretenses and with certain changes and so on and so forth. So you have this second option. The third option is to tell the other group to go away. We don't want you. And it happened all the time. With the Jews, for instance. They didn't like them for one reason or another, or they wanted to squeeze money and so on. So we don't want you. Go away. So Jews were expelled from England, from France, and from other places, and go find a home somewhere else. The fourth option is to kill them, which is genocide. And that happens all the time, but not always, because there are other options. And so genocide is not something that must happen, but something that may happen and happens. But there's a fifth option, you see. And the fifth option is you are here and we are there, and we don't love you, but there's no reason why we should fight. So let's live next to each other. We'll start trading and so on, and some communication. And over time, maybe this becomes an alliance, an agreement. Take, for instance, France and Germany. They were enemies 100 years ago. So the idea of a collaboration between France and Germany was absolutely impossible. The idea between England, not Scotland, England and France, same thing. And I'll never forget, I went to Lithuania once, to Vilnius, and I met with a colleague, a Lithuanian professor of history, and he, in joke, but not totally in joke, he said to me, you know, we can arrange ourselves with the Jews one way or the other over time, but with the Poles, never. Because Lithuania and Poland were at war with each other. At the end of World War I, the Poles conquered Vilna against the Lithuanians. And there were no relationships for a while. Today they are allies. Nobody will dream of a war between Lithuania and Poland. Or for that matter, today, between Cambodia and Thailand, for instance. Or between Thailand and Burma. They may not love each other, but nobody thinks of a war. So there are 5 options. And when we say that we want to fight genocide, we are talking about the fifth option. Is there a move towards something like that? Yes. I don't know whether it'll succeed. I'm no prophet, I don't know. But there's an international organization with which some of us who deal with the Holocaust are connected. It's called Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes, or in letters, GAMAC, Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes. It's founded by the Swiss with a lot of money. And today it has about 38 governments that try to find a way to influence the United Nations, as within the United Nations, the Security Council, to actually act in prevention, punishment, and action against mass atrocity crimes. The peak of these crimes is the genocide. Now, we are talking about definitions here, and the problem with definitions is that all definitions that we invent are abstractions from reality. Reality is always much more complicated than our invention of abstractions is. We try to encompass the reality now in definition. It never works completely. And so instead of trying to adapt our definition to the reality, we very often try to, hopelessly of course, try to adapt the reality to our definitions. Doesn't work. Now, in order to define, that means to come as close as possible to reflect what actually happens. What we are doing is we are talking about genocide as the act, the intent and action to destroy a human group as such, whether they are ethnic or national, or according to racist ideology, racist, or religious, or political, or economic, or cultural. If we want to murder them, that's genocide. Obviously, then, the Holocaust was a genocide. I don't have to prove that. The definition itself already says it. But anyone who looks at genocide today has to start from the Holocaust. Because after 1948, all genocides, all mass atrocity crimes relate one way or to the other to the example of the Holocaust. Let me give you a case in point where this is so obvious, or two cases. One is Rwanda. Now, according to the definition of the United Nations, it also actually should not have been called a genocide, because the two contending groups there, the Hutu and the Tutsi, are not ethnic or national groups. They are social groups. They speak the same language. They have the same culture. They go to the same churches. They're Christians. So, they are not a genocide. Well, of course it was a genocide, because they were invented political groups. If we take the case of the most recent case in Burma, of the Rohingya Muslim group who are pushed out with massive murder by the Buddhist majority in Burma into Bangladesh, when you analyze that and you translate that into political action or political thought, today, you relate to the Holocaust consciously. The people who deal with aiding the Rohingya who fled to Bangladesh, those who managed to flee to Bangladesh in terrible camps, are in great part groups that also deal with Holocaust memory. For instance, the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles, who sent groups to the Rohingya camps to document what had happened because they are about documenting the Holocaust, so they document Rohingya. They are not Holocaust survivors. They are young people who work in the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. And we at Yad Vashem are connected with them very closely. So, you know, everything that connects today with what is happening today, quite naturally and logically, is connected to the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is genocide. So obviously, it parallels other genocides in many ways, which some people don't like. They say, you can't compare the Holocaust with anything else. Of course you can, because otherwise you can't make out a difference between them. Anything that you deal with the Holocaust has to be compared, because that only comparison will tell you how different the Holocaust is from other genocides. So this argument, we can't compare, is pure and absolute nonsense. But when we do compare, what comes out? First of all, where are the parallels? The major parallel, and that is extremely difficult for us Jews to accept, is the suffering of the victims, because you can't measure suffering. You can't compare on equal terms. You can't say which was worse, death in the gas chamber in Auschwitz, or being shot in the neck in a ditch in the Ukraine, or being starved to death as an Armenian in the Armenian genocide in 1916-17 in the desert in Iraq. People died there in huge masses, simply not being given any food or water. Was that worse, or is that worse? Is the killing of children in one case worse than the killing of children in another case? Is torture, terrible torture, happens all the time, worse in one case or another? Can you compare torture to other torture? You can't. It's torture. Murder is murder. Suffering is suffering. Jews suffered no more and no less than other people in situations of mass murder, torture, and death. Now, that is a very important base of comparison, because from there you go on. How exactly? The second comparison, the second thing where the things are parallel, is the way that the perpetrator acts. They always acted with the best possible means at their disposal. The Germans had gas, so they used it. The Germans had a bureaucracy, so they used it. The Germans had railways, so they used them. The Germans had machine guns and rifles, so they used them. In the Rwandan genocide, no railways were used because they don't have any railways. No gas was used because they didn't have any gas. They used a bureaucracy which they learned from the Europeans and which already had pre-existed in the pre-colonial times. African independence in Rwanda, the bureaucracy had already existed. So there you have some parallels. But it's the best possible means at their disposal. How did people kill other people in Rwanda? Mainly by knives, machetes. Where do they have machetes in Rwanda from? They don't have any iron mines. So where did they have the iron for the machetes? And the answer is that they were very well educated. They had studied at the best universities in Belgium and France, the perpetrators, the heads of the perpetrators. And they imported 1.8 million machetes from China, from communist China, right? And with those machetes, they killed their neighbors, sometimes their family members. So the best possible means they had at their disposal. That's parallel. And then, of course, the very killing. The idea, as I said before, of killing another group. Why? What for? And there the difference comes in. Because along with the parallels, there are differences between the Holocaust and all other genocides. All other genocides. The difference is not in the numbers. More Chinese peasants were killed by the Mao Zedong dictatorship in the 1970s than Jews in the Holocaust. A higher proportion of Armenians died as a result of the genocide in Armenia by Ottoman Turkey in World War I. 40%. 30% of all Jews were killed by the Germans and their collaborators. So it's not that. It's something else. All genocides, without any exception, were done for pragmatic reasons. Take, for instance, the argument in Australia, which is going on in the intellectual sphere in Australia, including by some very important Jewish historians and sociologists. For instance, our late friend Colin Tutts and many others. Was there genocide of the Aborigines? Yes or no? Most people say yes. And when you look at why they were killed because the whites wanted the land and they wanted the resources, and the Aborigines didn't want to give up the land and their ways of living. And so there's a pragmatic reason. Get rid of the blacks, they said in 19th century Australia, because they are in the way of our expansion and founding our country and so on and so forth. So pragmatic reasons everywhere. Pragmatic reasons when there was a genocide during World War II of the Poles by Germany. They wanted to annihilate the Polish people as such, not all Poles. They needed millions of Poles for slave labor, so they didn't want to do what they did to the Jews. But the reasons why they did that to the Poles was purely pragmatic. They needed the work, they wanted the land, they wanted the resources, purely pragmatic. When you take any case in South Africa, the wars between the whites and the Bantus were over land, over resources, over mines. The wars everywhere in America against the American Indians, in Canada against the First Nations, and so on, everywhere. It's always pragmatic. There were no pragmatic reasons for killing the Jews. None at all. The Jews did not control German economy. That's a pure invention. There was not a single German industry that was owned by a Jewish family in 1932. There had been one. It still exists, the AEG, the electric company, which was owned by the Jewish Rathenau family, no longer by 1932. It was owned by Germans, pure Germans, Aryan Germans, if you like. The Jews occupied the middle positions. The Jews owned supermarkets, the first supermarkets, 5 of them in Germany. But let's the middle ground. No industry, not chemical, not iron, not steel, not coal, not transportations. Nothing was owned by Jews. Pure invention. Jews didn't control any other economy. Jews participated in the economy. Jews were the middle class, sometimes the higher middle class, sometimes people who employed large numbers of other people because they were traders, because they helped the economy by being merchants, by being industrialists on a middle level, sometimes on a slightly higher level. None of these industries, none of these Jewish economic ventures controlled any economy. So it's not for economic reasons. And in any case, they took away the property of the Jews. Why do they kill them after they have taken away the property? There's no point. They use them as slaves, can't they? No. They had to kill them for non-economic reasons. The Jews didn't have any political presence. They had no state. There was no political Jewish organization, international one, until 1936, the World Jewish Congress, which was founded as a result of the Nazi ascension to power. And the World Jewish Congress, not then and not today, controls the Jewish community. It sometimes represents them. Yeah? No political presence. Jews didn't have any army. Jews didn't own any land. So why kill the Jews? You know, there was some of the older ones amongst you may remember the old Jewish German joke, which said, who is responsible for all the ills of the world? And the answer is the Jews and the bicycle riders. And the answer is, why the bicycle riders? And the co-answer is, why the Jews? Makes it any more sense? Now, the Jews were the enemy for ideological reasons. The ideological reasons were originally theological. It didn't start with Christianity, by the way. It started before Christianity. Under Hellenistic rule in the Middle East, when the Hellenistic kings wanted to unify the culture of all the peoples so that all of them should worship the same gods and recognize the kings as gods. And the Jewish civilization, including the Jewish religion, of course, developed in a different way. And by the 3rd century BC, when this began, the Jews could no longer accept this, could not recognize a king as a god, which was the main reason why they could not recognize Jesus as a god, because God can't have a son, and God can't be a king who is worshipped in body. A king of kings, yes, but as a spirit, not as a body. And the ideological view of the Jews was that they were enemies of God because they didn't recognize the various statues, and they didn't recognize Christianity afterwards, they didn't recognize Islam later on, so they were enemies of God. And when you know what you have to do with enemies of God, you have to persecute them. And in certain situations, you develop this into a killing, a genocide. Now, this development took time. What we call anti-Semitism, by the way, the term anti-Semitism is nonsense, because there's no Semitism that you can be anti to. There are Semitic languages, which include languages that have absolutely nothing to do with either Jews or Arabs. But anti-Semitism, and I am using the term although I know it's nonsense, developed over time, and the ideology remained. The economic situation changed, the political situation changed, but anti-Semitism continued Not everywhere, not at all, not in all countries, not in all Christian countries, not in all Muslim countries. But yes, occasionally, yes, it became a latent civilization force. As a colleague of mine in Tel Aviv University put it, anti-Semitism has became a part of Western civilization, an integral part, not necessarily expressed, not necessarily agreed to by everyone. No, opposition to anti-Semitism also existed, but it existed. It developed from theology to economics to politics to social attitudes to in modern times, to nationalism, then to racism, and the peak of racism then became the Nazi form, the Nazi mutation of anti-Semitism, because the Nazi anti-Semitism is a mutation of traditional anti-Semitism, both the continuation and the change. Both old ideas, and if you look at Nazi literature, they didn't invent anything, they repeated what was said before. But then it mutates into a political ideology that requires political action, that requires military action, that requires physical action, that requires murder. And it hasn't died. It has not died. We are talking about neo-Nazism. We're talking about radical ideologies. We're talking as though Nazism was dead. Don't make any mistake. It mutates, it changes slightly. But it hasn't disappeared. We are living today in 2020 in a world in which National Socialism, Nazism, is alive and unfortunately well. It's not, I'm not talking about those marginal neo-Nazi, skinheads and so on. That's marginal. I'm talking about the basic attitudes. And the basic attitudes, for instance, come into play when you talk about radical Islam today. Because radical Islam, in its relationship to the Jews, repeats the ideology of Nazism. It says the Jews are responsible for everything. Radicalism, that's not Islam. It's a mutation of Islam. Because Islam didn't say that. Radical Islam, which is something that was invented in the 20th century, parallel to Nazism. Radical Islam was founded in 1928 by an Egyptian teacher by the name of Hassan al-Banna. And he repeated Nazi ideology in Muslim terms, changing Islam to accommodate to this ideology, and that exists today. And then it is copied by others, only in monotheistic societies. You don't have anti-Semitism in China. You don't have anti-Semitism in India, and even in a Muslim country like Indonesia. There is a political problem with Israel, but if you have an Israeli passport, you can easily enter Indonesia, nothing will happen to you. There's no anti-Semitism in Indonesia. And no Jews, of course, or very few. Yeah? So, and not in Black Africa. I don't know what you're talking about when you talk about anti-Semitism. So, it's monotheistic societies in a certain what we call Western world. Western world includes Muslim world. And so you have a situation today where the Holocaust exists. I'll give you one quotation, which is, I could quote to you endlessly. The theological leader of radical Islam today is in Qatar. Yeah, his name is Sheikh Yusuf Karadawi. He's an Egyptian who lives in Qatar. He's a theologian. He's a theologian of radical Islam. And in January 2009, on TV. Al Jazeera TV. You can look at it if you know Arabic. He said the Jews were punished for their insolence by Allah through Hitler. But next time we will do it better. Next time we will do it, the Muslims. It's not a denial of the Holocaust. It's an approval of the Holocaust. It's a wonderful idea, the Holocaust. And then, of course, there's a denial of the Holocaust. And then there's a distortion of the Holocaust. And the distortion is not only in the Muslim world. Actually, most of it is in the non-Muslim world, in the Christian world, in Poland, in Hungary. Because you have to invent a usable path, a nationalist path. And nationalism is a bane that we have to fight. Now, I don't accept the idea of uniqueness of the Holocaust. The title of my lecture is wrong. I don't accept the idea of a uniqueness, because if I said that the Holocaust was unique, I would be saying that it cannot be repeated. It was unique only once. But that's not true. It can be repeated, not only towards Jews, but to anyone by anyone under certain situations. It cannot be repeated exactly. Nothing is ever exactly repeated, but approximately repeated. And so the Holocaust is not unique. It's unprecedented, which means that it was a precedent. And you are here listening to me because you are part of a Yad Vashem ideology, if you like, to prevent as far as possible for something like that to happen again. No slogans. Never again is a stupid slogan because it's happening all the time. It's ever again, not never again. But we fight as much as we can through education, through commemoration, through alliances with lots of people all over the world who share our views. Because the Jews are a small people, 13 million, 14 million altogether, amongst billions of other people. We need allies, and we have allies. Our Christian and Muslim friends who will join us in fighting anti-Semitism, who will together with us commemorate the Holocaust, who will together with us educate about the Holocaust, who will together with us write about the Holocaust, and try our best to be part of a world in which the Holocaust will not be a precedent, but a warning. Thank you.
Now, Professor Bauer, I'd like to thank you most sincerely for this fascinating, insightful, and thought-provoking presentation. I've heard you several times before, and you always challenge normal thinking. And in this particular case, you certainly have. I've often heard that your audiences are transfixed by the compelling evidence and passionate delivery you present. And today was no different. Professor Bauer, thank you most sincerely for your great eloquence, your deep and constant analysis, and for answering some of our questions, if we can do it. I also want to thank Yad Vashem for organizing this event. It's no easy feat to overcome the technological and logistical challenges, especially of an event that spans several time zones. So well done. Last but not least, I wish to thank all the people in the audience, if I can call it that. Thank you for watching and for listening. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this lecture, and if you would like to be invited to future lectures of this nature, as I farewell you, there will be a slide at the end showing a Yad Vashem email address to which you can send your name and email details, so please take a moment to note it. Once again, thank you all for being part of this Yad Vashem program and for hearing one of the doyens and global authorities on Holocaust, Professor Yehuda Bauer. Shalom and good health to all.
Okay, Professor, there's a few questions which I sent you on the chat. Are you able to read them?
Yeah, what was it? I was asked, what was the pragmatic reason for the Hutus murdering the Tutsis in Rwanda? Economics. The Hutus wanted to control the land and the cattle that was largely owned by the 15% of Tutsis in Rwanda. And that was the basic reason. And there was a movement amongst the Hutu, which started already in 1958, to get the possessions of the Tutsi into their hands. So the motivation was very clearly economic.
One question is, so why did the Germans pick the Jews for extermination?
Well, because they saw in the Jews a satanic group that had entered into history for unknown reasons, and they were a danger to all of humanity. And as long as Jews existed, there would be no advance in civilization and so on. And all advances in civilization, according to the Nazi ideology, were made by the so-called northern peoples of the Aryan race. That was complete nonsense, but that is what they believed in.
Professor, one more question is, could you comment on the anti-Semitism that is prevalent on campuses today?
Well, it's a continuation of the old thing. I mean, today what is added is a violent anti-Israeli attitude, which really aims at the destruction of the Jewish state. And that, of course, if you want to destroy the state of Israel, which happens to have about 79% Jews in it, then you are an anti-Semite because it's a Jewish state. So, but one should not misunderstand this. There is a great deal of anti-Semitism in universities and colleges in America, but there are hundreds of colleges and universities where nobody really cares about this. And even when they do care, it's minorities who care. So it exists, it's a danger, it's very problematic. One should not minimize it, but one should not see this, as a existential danger for Israel. It is a danger for the Jewish communities in those places where these colleges and universities are located. Yes. So anti-Semitism is something that is again happening, and the Corona crisis is part of this because. In part, in some extreme cases, many extreme cases, Jews are being blamed for the pandemic. Jews invented the Corona crisis.
Professor, we have one last question, if we may. Would you please comment on the comparison of apartheid and Israel government policies?
Yeah. This is not something that we deal with at the Vashem in any depth or any detail because we are not concentrated on that. But apartheid was a racist idea. Black people were denied basic rights and so on. The violent Israeli nationalism against Arabs in the occupied territories is nationalist, not racist. There is racism in Israel, unfortunately, but it's directed against Jews, against Black Ethiopian Jews. The problem that we have between Jews and Arabs in Israel is not racist. It's nationalist. And the problem is not separation between Jews and Arabs on buses or in toilets or I don't know where, but the question of national rights for something completely different. It's very serious. It's very problematic. But if you look, for instance, at the present corona crisis, the Israeli hospitals, which dealt actually quite efficiently with the crisis, there is about 1/3 of all the manpower in the hospitals, in the Israeli hospitals, are Arabs. Arab doctors, Arab nurses, women and men. If you look at universities, they are underrepresented, but they are represented. There are many Arab intellectuals who are members of academic groups. So it's not apartheid. It's something else. It's a national quarrel between two peoples claiming the same small piece of land.
Professor, thank you so very much for sharing your great erudition with us. And Mr. Gandel, we thank you so much for your very insightful and warm words.
Let me just add something.
Please.
I see here from Mr. Lawrence Scher, could you please explain the rise of anti-Semitism in Poland, considering there are so few Jews? The rise of anti-Semitism in Poland is not connected to the Jews there, because there are only 15,000 Jews in Poland. Well, it's connected to the past, and I'm publishing something just now in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs on this. It's a internal Polish quarrel between Polish nationalists and Polish liberals over the interpretation of the past. And in order to do that, the nationalists distort Holocaust memory, completely distorted. And that is a real problem. I've written about it, and I hope to write about it in the future again. And so if you contact me, I can give you a bibliography online. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody. And that concludes our lecture with Professor Bauer. And thank you very much once again, Professor Bauer and Mr. Gandel.